quickly kind of go through some of the different nations and powers that began colonizing and taking control of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. So we have the Dutch, right? Kind of at this point, by the time we get to the industrial age, the 1800s and 1900s, the Dutch are not, they're not a large, well-established empire. Their kind of imperial days have passed. They were a much larger empire back in the 15 and 1600s. However, some remnants of that still exist. So what were called the Spice Islands at the time, because of the rich supply of different spices they had, is parts of modern day Indonesia, and I'll show maps throughout just to kind of give you a sense of where all these things are. But modern day Indonesia in the South Pacific. And it went over time. Went from the Dutch East India Company, which was similar to the British East India Company of India. Control went from them to Dutch government control. Britain has kind of a much stronger presence in the South Pacific than the Dutch, but even so, their strength lies in Africa and the Middle East and India. However, they control lands known as Burma and Malay. Today, the countries of Myanmar and Malaysia. Burma is actually annexed or added to the British Empire in 1886. Malay is important for its important city of Singapore, which today is a major financial center of the world and actually is technically an independent nation today. It's a city-state. And the British wanted this land because they had lots of supplies of rubber and tin, which were key for industrialization. Also in Southeast Asia, we have the French in what is known as Indochina. It's known that because it's the territory of land in between India and China, the modern-day nations of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And this is going to be important to know that because this is going to come back to us when we get a little bit further on in the Cold War and the Vietnam War. Siam, which is modern-day Thailand, is actually interesting because it's one of them, similar to Africa, how most nations were kind of carved up and taken by other powers, except for Ethiopia and Liberia. They remained independent. Thailand, Siam is like that as well. They managed to remain independent. And again, kind of geopolitics come involved here, right? Because the French had Indochina, the British had Burma. Siam is situated in between the two. And so it kind of made geopolitical sense to keep a buffer between the two colonies. So the French and British kind of agreed to leave Thailand alone. The Philippine Islands in the South Pacific. By the 1500s, they had come under Spanish control. And from the 1500s almost to the 1900s, the Spanish held control over the Philippine Islands. However, in the year 1898, the United States gets involved in a war with Spain over an issue in Cuba. And it's called, from the American perspective, it's called the Splendid Little War because it lasts just about a year. And the Americans gain several islands as a result of it. They handedly defeat the Spanish. Because again, just like the Dutch, whose imperial days were in the past, the 1600s, same thing with the Spanish, right? Their imperial days were really the 1500s when they kind of settled most of the New World, right? Latin America. So they gain control of the islands, in addition to the islands of Puerto Rico and the island of Cuba. And they gain control of it. However, the Filipinos, the natives of the Philippines, wanted independence. They didn't want to be ruled by somebody else. And so following the 1898 Spanish-American War, there's the American-Filipino War, which lasts a couple of years. And eventually the Americans kind of put the rebellion down, but they do promise future self-rule, right? So they promise the Filipinos that eventually they'll be independent. And they kind of follow through with that promise at the end of World War II. There's a lot of agricultural and strategic benefits to the Philippines. It's kind of close to the growing power of Japan, for example, and kind of can keep in check the Japanese, and also is, closer. There's ports then able to trade more easily with the Asian, natural resources that are in Asia. There's also agricultural benefits. It becomes a big sugarcane growing industry for the American population. Right, so here's kind of just a map showing you the Southeast Asia region. Siam or Thailand, that independent nation here in the middle, but the reddish looking color here is all the British possessions. The Dutch is the yellow, so these are modern day Indonesia, island of Borneo, for example. The French in Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. the Americans, Spanish, and then the Americans in the Philippines. And China is still here, obviously. The British will also come to take control of the city of Hong Kong in China. So now moving from the kind of Southeast Asian realm to the kind of the Pacific Islands, right? Many powers, European powers, American powers at this time, began realizing that it could be helpful to have islands throughout the Pacific kind of as jumping off points and strategic middle points between the trades of Asia and the ports of America, to kind of essentially connect the empire with its colonies. Additionally, this imperial effort to limit the power of other nations, so you just kind of take land because it's there to take, so to prevent other people from taking it. So in the South Pacific Islands, you have France, who comes to control Tahiti. The United States has Samoa, Hawaii, eventually Midway as well. And so all these places are meant to kind of strategic locations. America and Hawaii is kind of an interesting story because Hawaii was an independent nation. Queen Liliuokalani was the queen at the time, and she was being pressured intensely by the American sugar merchants and the pineapple trade in Hawaii, the American businessmen who were there. And eventually the American businessmen go to the United States and say, we need to do something here. And so Americans kind of launch a coup, and they overthrow the queen peacefully. They overthrow the queen in 1893. By 1898, the U.S. annexes or adds Hawaii to its empire. And then by 1959 is when Hawaii becomes a state. I believe the last of the 50 states, if not the 49th. In the Pacific world, the British also have control of Polynesia and the Marshall Islands. And then Japan, right, is where Japan comes in as the kind of non-European, non-Western imperial power. And they have control of Formosa, or the island of Taiwan, several other islands in the South Pacific. And this is what leads to a growing rivalry between the United States and Japan. As we get closer to World War II, the two key powers in the Pacific are the United States and Japan, and that's going to cause friction. Kind of two other important islands that have been kind of settled and colonized for a much longer time are Australia and New Zealand, but it's kind of during this time where they eventually gained some sort of independence. So Australia was first settled in 1770 and was claimed by a man named Captain Cook. The native indigenous people there are known as Aborigines to kind of modern people who were, like everywhere else, kind of negatively affected, right? They're exposed to new people, new diseases. They're treated differently, right? And so the populations decline. They're mistreated. And Australia is actually originally used as a penal colony for the British, meaning people who were convicted of crimes in Great Britain would be sent to Australia to live. Kind of interesting, right? So people who can kind of trace their ancestry in Australia back that far, it's likely because their ancestor then was a criminal of some sort. Not necessarily they were horrible people, but they might have been poor and they might have stolen, bread or something like that. They got caught and they were sent then to Australia. In 1851, gold is discovered in Australia, which leads to a much more rapid settlement of the continent. And then in 1901, they're given self-rule and they become the Commonwealth of Australia. Right, so they're still kind of formally part of the British Empire, but they have their independence as well. New Zealand, which are islands off the east coast of Australia, are settled by the native indigenous people there, the Maori, in the 1200s. The British, again, Captain Cook claims it by 1769, so the year before Australia. And they eventually get self-rule or dominion status, similar to what Canada will have before Canada becomes independent in 1907. So these are semi-independent nations by the time we get to the industrialized period, but still very much kind of associated with and connected with the British Empire. Here's kind of a map of the South Pacific, just to kind of give you a sense, right? New Zealand, Australia. We have Southeast Asia here as well, and then all these islands. We have some German territories, some American territories, French, right? Even Chile has a claim to Easter Island here. Hawaii up in the north. So all these nations kind of have control, some aspect of control over these islands.